Welcome, everyone. Welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm Andrea Brewster. I'm a faculty member at Calbright College, a California State Community College, and I specialize in curriculum and assessment. For the past several years, I have also been a part of a community of practice called SPACE, um, Student Partnerships in Assessment Community of Engagement. And in this last year, I've been co-facilitating this thoughtful group of researchers and practitioners in various higher ed institutions around what it means to partner with students in educational assessment. Joining me today are some of the members of the SPACE group. I will offer each an opportunity to introduce themselves. Perhaps we should go left to right. And Sandra, could I call on you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sandra Hebert. I'm the Director of Assessment and Compliance at McPherson College in Central Kansas. We're a small liberal arts college, and I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Hi, everyone.
Melissa, you want to go?
Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. Melissa Coe. I'm an assessment specialist at UC Berkeley in their Center for Teaching and Learning. UC Berkeley is a large public R1 university.
Hello, everyone. Adriana Signorini. I'm at a minority serving institution, the University of California, Merced, and I coordinate there the Students Assessing Teaching and Learning program. It is a pedagogical support. And also I'm the Educational Assessment Coordinator for the Center for Engaged Teaching and Learning.
Hello, everyone. My name is Corin Sloan. I'm the Faculty Associate for Assessment at Cal State Monterey Bay. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Carla Strickland Hughes. I'm an Assessment Associate at the Colorado School of Mines, which is a medium-sized engineering and STEM R1 university in beautiful Golden, Colorado.
Thank you, everyone. So, by way of introducing this conversation today, I want to begin by naming something that many of us in this room already know and probably explains why you showed up to the session today. The idea of students as partners in educational assessment is not new, and it is not untested. In fact, across higher education, we have ample evidence that when students are meaningfully engaged in inquiry about their own learning and experiences, and not merely respondents, but as collaborators, assessment becomes more relevant, more humane, and more intellectually honest. That promise has been articulated in the literature, explored in prior conferences, and demonstrated in pockets of practice. So rather than spending our time today persuading you that student partnership matters, we'd like to focus instead on a more complicated and perhaps more familiar question: what it means to try to practice this work seriously and in systems and systems that sometimes were not designed for it. And because the reality is that many of us sit with a persistent tension. We're asked to advance assessment that's rigorous and comparable and often compliance driven. And at the same time, we're holding these commitments to equity, inclusion, student-centered learning. And student partnership, as exciting as it is, can promise a way through that tension. But I want to be clear, it doesn't resolve that tension. In fact, it often brings that tension into sharper relief. Partnership with students requires us to slow down processes that are often optimized for efficiency. It asks us to share interpretive authority in systems that are top down. And it challenges longstanding assumptions about expertise, assumptions that many of us have been professionally socialized to uphold. So that brings us to the heart of what we want to explore today. What does it actually mean to hold a vision that we cannot fully enact? What does it mean to take student partnership seriously as an ethical stance, an epistemological stance, even when our own institutional structures and timelines and incentives make that full realization impossible. For many of us, and I think for many of us in the space group, the work is not about achieving a perfect model of partnership with students. It's about instead choosing to work at the edges of what's permitted, to create moments of shared inquiry, co-interpretation, mutual learning, even when those moments are partial and provisional and sometimes quite fragile. So we'd like to invite you all to resist the urge to resolve this tension too neatly. And we will share some of our own stories today about how student partnership is a process that we continually negotiate. And I would invite you to evaluate this conversation not by with a measure of success around whether we fully inhabit our conceptual ideals, but rather how willing we are to let those ideals continue to shape how we ask questions, how we interpret evidence, and how we imagine what assessment could be. At this point, we will share some of our the pitfalls and solutions that we've defined for ourselves in conversation over the past couple years, and give you some perspectives from our unique positions and our various institution types. Adriana, I'll hand it to you to introduce our first theme.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. One of the pitfalls we identify is the power imbalances between students, the enrolled students in the course, the faculty, or students as partners and their staff. Sometimes the students feel they have no voice and their perspective doesn't count in making any decision. My minority serving institution, as I research intensive, as I mentioned before, where research faculty are usually very busy producing research and they disregard this affective aspect of teaching while focusing on developing students' content and skills. Under these circumstances, students feel that they are feel intimidated and sometimes in many cases define faculty as condescending. A solution that we use as a student as partners a process is that we practice is collecting the student perspective on their learning experience through different structure tools to allow faculty to reflect on their teaching practices together in collaboration with undergraduates. So in this way, faculty learn ways of showing their enrolled students that they care. They care for their student learning, which faculty do, but is not communicated effectively through their actions. Corinne, what do you think about this?
I really appreciate that perspective, Adriana. I think one of the possible solutions to augment that is to actually increase the visibility of student contributions. So perhaps that's on a website or a dashboard, or maybe it's in our campus social media, or even the community news, or a way that we share shout outs or bright spots, maybe in a department or a college newsletter, or maybe even through our student awards or recognizing the contributions that students make to assessment. Increasing their visibility, I think, can help students feel welcome and valued.
I agree, Corin. We make sure that all student contributions are recognized, especially if we're putting out a published report, that we know what students participated in creating that. I also make sure just in when I talk about things that in front of faculty or in front of staff that I acknowledge the components of student contributions. And as much as possible, try and put the students in front doing the actual presenting of the work that they've done. I also try and make sure that students are never alone representing themselves. When I started, we had one student on our assessment committee, and that's a lonely space to be when you've got a room full of faculty and staff and you're the only student. I couldn't change the official committee makeup, but I have our student data intern come and take minutes so that there's another student in the room. And I think trying to honor that space and make as much room as possible for students to be together in this is another great way to balance that imbalance.
Thank you all for sharing those great ideas. I think what's really striking me here is that there's an assumption that there's some reciprocity in the work, that the students are, you know already that the students are doing important work that can be recognized and named. I think one thing that's also helped in my context with this power imbalance has been to consider ways that students can also engage maybe asynchronously. So for example, rather than having those two students join the same committee meeting with the faculty and staff, of course they'd be welcome, but are there ways where ideas and thoughts can be solicited asynchronously in advance so that those ideas could be elevated and maybe they're not feeling the same pressure to represent all students live in a really fast-paced way there, depending on what type of work that might be. So thank you so much. I'm curious what we think about the level of student engagement and consistency.
Well, I'll jump in here. This is a topic related to power imbalances, but it's a little bit different. We're student availability, level of interest, level of engagement is not our level of availability, interest, and engagement in every moment, right? And part of our roles as professionals, regardless of where we are positioned within an institution, is to mentor students as learners. We're both stakeholders, our students, and we are, but we have different needs, different goals, and assessment work in particular is necessarily nested as in a professionalized and institutional way. And one of the ways that I've tried to approach this with students in the past is to honor student perspectives as much as I can, even when I can't include that perspective on a particular deliverable or on a particular timeline, by coming back to that perspective and finding other places to elevate it and integrate it. Melissa, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it really resonates saying that they don't necessarily have the same level of interest, or I guess I'd say commitment that we do. This is our full-time work. But for students, it's just one of many things that they're dealing with, that they're thinking about. So yeah, when I'm working with my student partners, I really do think about student motivation or just inherent motivation, maybe a little external motivation too. So usually when I'm framing a position and framing some sort of engagement where students would, contribute work, weigh in on something, I'm usually asking myself what's in it for them. Like, why would they want to do this? And I try to be really honest with myself about that task. In general, at my institution, when we bring on students, we really try to make it as appealing, as engaging as we possibly can, like thinking about what the title is, what the role and responsibilities look like. Would a student want to be in that place? And I will also just say at my institution, I'm luckily able to offer pay because from my perspective, a lot of the work we do is hard. They're doing it on top of their schoolwork. And sometimes the world of assessment can be quite thankless. We're not always everyone's favorite person to see knocking on their door. But in general, it's like I want students to have a positive experience. I think if they're, they feel good about this job, they want to show up, they want to be more involved, they're invested in their relationship to me and to others on my staff. But that takes extra effort, time to mentor and craft that really positive experience for them.
These are such great ideas, and I'm really like hearing good themes about the reciprocity and respect in the way that you're approaching your work with students and considering what's in it for them. One thing that's worked for me, so I've worked with different cohorts of students in assessment who are doing kind of qualitative or mixed methods projects, interrogating other students' experiences with feedback and with achieving different learning outcomes across the curriculum. And where possible, I try to give the students on my team choice in terms of their specific focus and themes and topics or tasks. That wasn't always a possibility in the beginning, especially as I was sort of building the program with my colleague, Nicholas McConnell, like with the students as we were going. But as I had a better sense of what that structure was, I was better able to transparently sort of explain where there was choice in the work. I was better able to also have that discourse with students about, what skills they might be practicing in doing that work, and then also maybe giving them choice in things that may not really be upholding that full reciprocity. If there were some tasks that might be a little bit less engaging for them, instead of requiring that for the whole team, just offering it to those who wanted some additional hours to, treat it as a job as well. So thank you so much, Melissa and Andrea, for sharing those ideas. It really is giving me a lot to think about.
I'm really curious listening to the ideas that folks are surfacing, how in the midst of this work you address the quality of the results. We know that reliability and validity is so important when we're sharing our findings. How do you do that with students in a meaningful and measurable way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we have to be really honest that students relative to us are novices. And so I think as much as we'd want to view them as like, now there's two of us, we'll be twice as productive. I think we have to be realistic, they need to, there's a lot they still need to learn. And again, they have many different priorities. So in general, when I'm thinking of ensuring that quality comes out of the student partnership, I always am thinking about how can I create a situation where the student is likely to be successful? And so I think about things like maybe they do need accountability, and what would that accountability look like? Are they getting enough opportunities to practice the skills before it becomes, high stakes and they really need to deliver? Are they getting enough feedback on their work? Very often my students will actually work in pairs, and then we have, team meetings or one-on-ones where they're, showing a work in progress and getting feedback on it. And so that's kind of ways that I create, again, those accountability structures or those practice and feedback structures. But I think when it comes to quality, I mean, when you're assigning your students these different tasks or different projects, I think being really thoughtful about like, is this really a reach for them? Like, what should I really expect them to be able to produce if they've never done something like this before, for example, or if it's really not an area that's their strength, versus if you cater to their strength and you're like, okay, you're very competent in visual design, way more than me, then it might make sense that you really get quality out of that. So just in general, offer ongoing trainings and also just be ready to check student work and, think about what the stakes are for what task you're giving your students.
Thank you, Melissa. I also agree that tapping on students' talents and goals is a way to go so that they can bring in the best. In our programs I mentioned, we conduct a structure assessment activities such as mid-semester feedback, classroom observations. So we have scripts and we rehearse them beforehand so the students feel more comfortable and they loosen up before going in front of a class. And also for reports. We have how to generate a report out of that. We have some templates that they can look at for references. So we share documents produced by the students and discuss how well they align with the guidelines so that they can gauge the importance of the report layout and accuracy, and also start paying attention to detail from early in the semester. I usually say if the report is not tidy, how do you feel the audience is going to trust our word? Sandra, what do you think about?
I agree that collaborative work from the beginning is really important. I don't send my students off and just say, go do, and then come back with a product. You've got to have checkpoints and spaces along the way where you're watching, where you can correct early if there are challenges. I also try and layer responsibilities and tasks on students as I get to know them better. When I know they can handle something, I will keep giving. If I see they're struggling, we may change course on what I'm having them do, or we might do some more training, or at least to check in and see sort of where the disconnects are. It's really important to clearly communicate standards, but also to find those ways to help students reach them. But I really love the piece that Melissa mentioned on taking advantage of those places where they're better than you. My reports and presentations are way better quality visually, since one of my data interns is a digital media major, and mad skills that I don't have. So I think it's important to frame it. What sometimes is a challenge of getting them to reach our standards or to understand the professionalism needed, sometimes they bring stuff that we don't have.
I love how students augment the work and can surprise us. I think the iterative nature of this is so fascinating. I wonder about the intensity. So students often organize their work around course terms or courses within those terms and exams and kind of the schedule associated with the syllabus. How do you accomplish time or labor intensive tasks, which often assessment projects are, within that time period? How do you solve the timing for yourself and for students?
This is absolutely something that I feel like I blundered early on, and I've really had to learn the hard way. I mean, in the ideal world, I feel like we would want students to work very consistently on the same projects from start to finish and have that really clean, linear story. But that's usually not practical. I find myself doing a lot of chunking of a project and handing the chunks to different people at different times. Encouraging students to do handoffs. I'm lucky enough to have a team of students, so sometimes students are passing it from, one person being in charge of a thing to somebody else because of those shifting availabilities. I will say sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised, I guess, that students may be free when you least expect it. I've had most of my students, go away for a holiday, and then one of the students being like, "Yes, I'll take on work. I'm, at home with my family, but I want some hours." And so, again, handing off things to the person who is free. I also think a lot of just about my work portfolio and trying to balance between me and my students. Like, if I can only focus my energy in certain places, I'm like, okay, well, I'll do the things they can't do because they're busy, midterms, final exams. I'll really focus on making sure those are covered. But when they have a lot of availability, I'm just like, okay, what more can I give them? Like, how can I lighten my load? Let me find the thing that they are able to do, and, really having my work accommodate theirs. So yeah, I wish that the students had a really cohesive work portfolio, but honestly, I find it just productive to be like, okay, where can we chunk things out and give them to the people who have the bandwidth?
I think the key out of what Melissa's talking about is that ability to be flexible, because it changes student to student, it changes week to week, it changes month to month, and I think being flexible with students and understanding that they need some of that flexibility is important. But I also try to make sure that we do as much of that scoping out at the beginning of the semester. If they know they're going to be in a theater production or they're an athlete or whatever other things they have going on a semester where they're in class all day Tuesday, Thursday, we'll try and adjust from the beginning to whatever those demands are and set our scope and our timeline. And I've had to work with the rest of the institutional practice. Oftentimes the student contracts were set from the first day of the semester to the last day of the semester, but it was really kind of an artificial constraint. And when I found out that students were willing to work some of those times before or after, just getting my contract set so that the hours could be flexed through that time made a big difference. And you don't have to get all your hours in that into finals week. You can come back the next week and finish up the project. And then just being creative when you have to be. We had a project set up for a student to do a presentation to a faculty meeting, and then the softball team made nationals. So we had them record it instead of do it live. I have a challenge that I think we've all acknowledged, and that is a space of how do you decide what of these things students can and can't do? We'd love to be able to give them everything, but there's just stuff that maybe isn't appropriate. I'm interested in how people decide what they give.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I wanted to just surface something that maybe folks don't think about, but again, I'm lucky enough to be able to offer paid positions for my students, but sometimes that funding comes with some strings attached. Maybe whoever has allocated that money for that student has a really a particular direction in mind. They want a particular project done. And so for that student, I have to really think like, okay, they were hired to do a particular job, and that expectation is there from the get-go and kind of predetermine some of the work that they do. But when I do have some flexibility, I mean, we kind of talked a little earlier about like thinking about student strengths and weaknesses. That's something you might be able to kind of glean from just, for example, if they apply for the job and they have an application, you can kind of glean that. You can also just talk to students and have them self-assess, where do they feel like they have an asset to bring to the work, or where are there areas where they're like, I'm not so good at this. It maybe is something I still need to learn. And so that kind of can help me think about allocating tasks. So it's kind of almost like a matrix of like students, where are their learning areas versus their strength areas, but also for tasks that are they like urgent tasks that are high stakes and just need to get done, or they're tasks where I have some flexibility. So, if a task is really urgent, needs to get done, give it to the student where that's their strength area because they'll nail it. But if it's an area where I have a little bit of leeway in the timeline, I can give that to a student who's a learner in that area because it's a time for them to practice. And yeah, they have the flexibility to just work their way through it. I don't need results by the next week. But yeah, I think personally, I do have some kind of red lines about where I don't assign certain tasks. I think surprisingly to some people, I actually have my students deal with a lot of things that you might not expect. Like my students deal with sensitive data because they're research assistants. So they have FERPA training, they have city training. They actually do that kind of stuff. The part where I'm kind of protective of them is sometimes in communication with faculty, especially if it's a faculty member I don't know, I don't have any relationship with. I very often will not just assign them like, oh, go email or go talk to that person. I usually am the intermediary because I don't know what that relationship would be like. And I want to, again, create these really positive experiences for my students.
That's interesting, Melissa, because at a very small school, I have sort of the opposite situation in that I can tell students to go talk to the professor, and they probably know the professor better than I, but I know the professor. But on the other hand, I don't give any sensitive FERPA information because they probably know all the students. And so we kind of protect that space. We also have a difficult learning management system that our student data system that I don't want to have to try and train them to figure out, because I'd way rather use the time with them to do the thing I cannot do myself, and that's get the student perspective and context, and get that student input too on any kind of communication stuff. So the place that I prioritize using students is where they will add that value as a student that I can't add. And then sometimes to just do, any number of those other tasks. But I think that's really interesting that sometimes it can be based just on the size and scale and type of institution that you're at.
In my case, to gauge whether the students are a good fit for the role they are applying to, we usually, as soon as they express their interest, students in the program provide the new candidates an informational session about the different things that we do in the program. And these informational sessions are important to see if they are a good fit for the role. And if they can see the way that they will grow in the program and where their talents will be most valuable at all. And once this places gives them a little bit of agency. I said, I'm good at this. I've said I could do this. So I'm more likely to do it. And it also, it is a solution for previous topics that we discussed before. So informational sessions, and then the fact that the informational sessions are offered by their peers, there's a chance for them to really ask the questions that they feel more strongly about, and to have honest, authentic opinions or responses from their peers in the program. I'm not there in those informational sessions, for example.
This is so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think, Melissa, I really appreciated this kind of balance that you mentioned about when it's a space where it's a student's kind of a learning area versus their strength area. The first time we were working with a group of students to do a project alongside our core competency assessment that was really capturing other students' experience, because we so much wanted to respect their perspectives as a learner, and make it a reciprocal, kind of meaningful experience for them. We gathered information about their goals at the beginning. And the first time that we went through this, I was really worried that there might be kind of a mismatch between the learning opportunities that I'd be providing them and then the goals that they had actually stated at the start. So as I iterated, I had to be a little bit kind with myself and have a bit more understanding about the scope of the project and the structure. But I also was able to bring in some places where students were prompted to do self-reflection, self-evaluation, and their goals might change as well. And even if they started with an ambition to build particular skills, that doesn't mean that they weren't interested in building other ones too. So really trying to highlight that. So it's really interesting to think about this balance that you're mentioning about those two different roles and how that might change depending on the context of the size of your school or some urgency for the project.
I really appreciate what all of you have said so far about engaging in conversation and continuing having an ongoing conversation with students about what the position is, how it can be reimagined, how tasks and their own learning goals can be better aligned. In the past, one thing I've done is to explicitly set some student learning outcomes with that student for that student in a student intern position, and then go back to those at the end of term and figure out whether how well we both worked towards the student achieving those learning outcomes and whether that's the right set of outcomes to take into the next term. I I've learned a lot through that about how better to understand what students think we're doing and what their priorities are. And then whenever I can, finding places to invite the work to adapt a little bit based on what our students are trying to gain as learners.
Think we have one more challenge to work on or bring up as addressing that oftentimes we recognize that we should be paying students and that their work is meaningful, but it can also be a big challenge. And sometimes we avoid including students because we know we can't pay them. So we talked a little about how we have addressed that. And one of the ways that I have is to not assume that there is not funds. I was able to get a student worker because I asked. It wasn't really clear how to go about doing that, but I could justify the work as being valuable. And sometimes it's easier to get a student worker than it is to get a full-time paid employee. So making sure that you don't assume that that's a pitfall and a problem, that you go ahead and do some asking. But also explore those opportunities for collaboration, like senior projects or working with student government on something that they're really passionate about. When students really care about something, they don't have to be paid. They just want to do it. So it's not making too many assumptions about either direction.
That's such an interesting conflict, Sandra, and I've had a similar position where obviously I feel strongly it'd be better if I could pay the students, but is it better than if I can't pay them if there's no opportunity for them at all? And a model that's worked for me is generalizing something I've done before for advising students in research and mentorship, where they do get course credit, pass no credit, on their transcript. Typically, we use something like 40 hours of documented work, gets that credit. And this can benefit students in several different ways. So if they were doing enough of that work, then it can help give them some more of that space in their schedule. So maybe they can maintain their full-time status for their grants and scholarships and aid, while doing this work and have one less class. So it kind of makes that space, that mental and time space for the work. On the other hand, I found that it actually also helped me approach that partnership a bit differently, where I had to have a syllabus. So I had to have clear learning goals and expectations. And it gave this structure that was familiar to all of us. It brought that into the space. So a student could drop if it wasn't a good experience for them. And maybe that's different than feeling pressure because of other changes and, leaving, quitting a job. It normalized some of the aspects of maybe the feedback and the mentorship and the self-evaluation, in a way that didn't add to this power imbalance, and it could counter their degree and show up on their transcript. I'm not really sure how much that matters, maybe more for some than for others. So that's one model that's worked for me. And then I know others have also, done this through partnership with the faculty who are teaching relevant courses, whether that's something in, economics and political science or psychology or sociology, but actually having the students who are doing already that project experiential work do something slightly related to the learning outcomes assessment or whatever assessment might be. So I haven't done that approach personally, except I have in my own research methods class, but those are some other creative ways that we can get the students those opportunities.
Yeah, if I could just ch quickly chime in, I just wanted to plus one what Sandra's saying about don't make assumptions about what you do or do not have without asking, or what you do or do not qualify for. And yeah, just being really creative and resourceful. I'm in a staff unit in a Center for Teaching and Learning. So in some ways, I feel kind of far from what is happening in departmental spaces. But one of our biggest growing majors in recent years has been data science. And I think at some point I just randomly got an email being like, oh, we're looking for people to be data science project mentors. And I kind of ignored it at first because I was like, oh, they're looking for people who work at like a nonprofit, or they're looking for people who are in industry, just to give, students in this really overcrowded major some experiential learning, something to show for their portfolio. And then I thought about it. I was like, well, Berkeley's a nonprofit. Like maybe I qualify, maybe I count. And I actually reached out and they were like, yeah, you could totally run a project. The folks who were part of that project, though, I had very different expectations than I would like a paid research assistant with my team. But nonetheless, they did really interesting work for me. So I think just being really creative and looking around for opportunities is important.
I think one of the pieces that's tied to that too is an opportunity maybe to partner with departments or programs that do assessment. So thinking about our Department of Education and Leadership as a space where students are already learning about assessment and are eager and in a position where they actually, for their courses, often need experience with assessment. So those might be spaces where there's a natural model that already exists for ways in which students can participate or engage in this work. But I think the other space is sometimes a plus one. We're at a space where we have variable sizes of programs. So sometimes we have a program that's really small with not a lot of faculty, and they could partner in a plus one sense with another department or program, maybe where students are already doing some of that assessment work. So really thinking, as Melissa said, creatively about how to connect and create partnerships, or how to leverage experience in a near peer mentoring way that takes those evidence-based practices and really truly makes them come to life for maybe more than one user.
So, as our audience can see, we are so enthusiastic and engaged in this work, and in a lot of different ways, space, places, and in different relationship with different students at different times. I'd like to pause at this point and ask a question of our panelists about participating in space, the student partnership community of engagement. How has it impacted or been meaningful to your work in assessment partnership with students?
Well, I'll jump in and say I have hugely appreciated this group. I'm always getting either a new idea or a reinvigorated passion for continuing to uphold the need for authentic student assessment partnerships.
I couldn't agree more. I often will go to one of our meetings and come away with something and I'm like, ooh, that's such a good solution or a next step to try and iterate with, a problem that I'm wrangling, or often just the conversation itself will result in clarity around how we can further assessment efforts, either through really amplifying student voice, or sometimes I love how my colleagues have thought deeply about equity and ways to connect student perspective to outcomes. So I think it's a really inspirational space.
Carla, I'll hand off to you at this point to engage us in a little discussion.
Well, thank you so much. As one of the folks who's been part of this group for the 3 years or the full time, I've also just found it really validating to hear the experiences of others and to learn from them. And just to have a group of folks that I get to check in with as my own professional development in the assessment space has evolved. I've put up into the chat a link to a form, and you can see there's a QR code on the screen here that, of course, we'll do a little bit of discussion about this conversation in a moment, but if you'd like to join us and be part of this Student Partners and Assessment community for engagement, then please, no commitment from filling out the form, just sharing your contact information with us so that you could be invited to join the monthly Zoom meetings. They are, I think, the third or the fourth Friday of the month currently for this term at like noon Pacific time. That might not be exactly correct, but it's correct whatever is on the form. It's on my calendar. I just show up, when it happens. Uh, but I'll also just give a really brief kind of overview of some of the things that I heard from this discussion, and then perhaps we'll have a few moments for your questions, audience, and some of the things I know that you're doing really exciting work, and you might be moved to share that as well. So a lot of what I was hearing from our conversation today reminds me of Alison Cook-Thatcher's model of engaging students as partners in teaching and learning. So she brings forward kind of three of these ideas that really the work needs to be grounded in for that partnership to be authentic. We have the respect, valuing but the different but equally valid perspectives that the faculty, staff, and students might bring. And typically, I first think about this as discipline expertise versus learner experience. But we really heard a lot of that. Like Corin and Sandra from the very beginning, they were talking about the ways to like recognize and name and award the work that the students were doing. So you could tell that it was just an implicit assumption from them that the work that they were doing was important. And also, the way that the panelists talked about the different skills that the students were bringing. So it wasn't limited to just the students being an expert on the learner experience, but recognizing their own discipline expertise and, fitting the tasks in with that balance of when it was a learning area versus a strength area for them. A second thing that the authentic partnership is really recommended to be grounded in is that reciprocity where both of the parties are contributing and benefiting. It's not a service model where the students are just helping. There's mutual learning and a value add for the students. And I think that we heard that throughout. I mean, really, when Melissa was talking about her red line being where students don't do any busy work, like this to me really exemplifies that reciprocity piece here as well. And then also when Sandra was, Corin are advocating to find that funding for the students to respect, what they're doing. And I heard from one of the panelists even, it may have been Melissa, like she's striving to have her work accommodate their work, right? I think this, again, really exemplifies that reciprocity. But there's also a third principle for that grounding of an authentic partnership, and that's shared responsibility. So moving away from this kind of consumer model, I pay, you teach, to a communal model where both parties are sharing the risk and the responsibility for that educational outcome. And we heard from Adriana some really interesting things there about the ways that she has particular structure and supports and templates for students, where they're really engaging in this really, fully built out model. But there's quality checks, and we're talking also, about what's in it for the students. And there is this kind of communal risk. So when we heard too about the kind of balance of when there may be a project that it needs a really fast turnaround and it's very important, that might not be the place where you're plugging students in for the learning area, but you're drawing, on their strengths. A lot of these things fit into that. And when Sandra was talking about how her reports are actually much better because of the student engagement, that's not only the shared responsibility, but also, again, that respect component. So I really appreciate the ways in which my colleagues in this space community here are exemplifying those, even though we're really centering and talking about some of the pitfalls and the ways that it actually can be a challenge to strive to this aspirational kind of authentic nature of student partnership. So it's really a process of engagement. It's not a product. I hope that that's something that you in the audience heard and took away from what the panelists were sharing. And I also, noticed that that process can be challenging. So there's difficult things to enact it. There's a tension and balancing act. So we're trying to balance actually things like the appropriateness of tasks or having trust for the student work, but also providing them appropriate guidance, giving them opportunities to practice, but being flexible, to their schedules and when the softball team has to go to finals. Really kind of balancing this collaborative spirit, but then making room for the mentorship and the guidance for the students, and places where structure, might help with that, and where it could also help to I've heard from all of my colleagues being really careful about aligning and matching the students' goals and skills and availability with the tasks and the timelines and with the institutional context. So there's so much to consider here. And I think that that's part of why, for me, the student partnership group is so helpful, because I get to hear about applications and solutions of similar problems in really different institutional contexts. It's also, you may be someone who could have been on this panel as well, or you could be someone who hasn't engaged with students in your assessment work at all. Regardless of which place you're at, like, I would encourage you to think about small steps, not climbing Mount Everest, for how you might either get started or maintain. And we've found it helpful in our work to do that through thinking about other partnerships on campus and established structures. Maybe this could happen through collaboration with career services or student government, thinking about those partners on campus with the common disciplines, like the ones we mentioned, sociology, computer science, psychology, et cetera, but not always those, where the students can bring those unique disciplinary backgrounds. Identifying maybe a guiding document, or looking for strategic alignment with what the students might bring and some of the things that your institution could be struggling with in that moment. Those actually sound like really big steps. I shouldn't have given them as examples of small steps. So maybe a small step you all could do would be to join us in the Student Partners in Assessment group. So I'm going to pose one question for you and invite you to either put your answer into the chat or unmute and share. And you're also welcome, instead of adding your answer to this question, if you have a question for us or some other discussion point you'd like to bring into the conversation. So for you to consider, whatever the next project is on your desk, it might be a survey design or focus group or something with a rubric. Where's one specific entry point in that project where you can invite a student in to make a decision, not just complete a task? And I think that decision versus task is really exemplifying some of that authentic partnership with the panelists we're talking about. Or like, where is a place in your work where student engagement could be brought in most easily? So open time, we'd love to hear from you, your questions, your thoughts about this prompt, or anything else.
I think this is a good sign, Carla. You've made everyone think.
Yes, and thank you for the wait time. Apologies, my dog was getting a little rambunctious in the background. But I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm currently serving as curriculum chair, and we're getting ready to welcome on board our very first student representative. The seat has been vacant for way too long. And so this really gave me a lot to think about in terms of where can I support this student? How can I welcome this student, and how can I create a safe space for this student, and really make sure that their voice is elevated within the team. So I'm walking away with so many ideas, and I just want to thank this panel. Really appreciate the dialogue today.
Well, we continue to let people think. I'll throw out one more idea for those spaces where you're feeling like you can't pay students enough, or can't honor and reward them enough. I also make sure that I supply ample snacks. I can't change the pay structure at the college, but I can make sure that they have granola bars and chips and things like that to make their time with us more enjoyable and more rewarding.
So a commenter came forward in the chat about trying to locate ways to better integrate and involve students in local level, program level assessment. I think all of the same principles apply, but maybe opportunities might be more limited.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. So, I transitioned in the past year from a private liberal arts university where my focus was primarily on the institutional level core competencies assessment. And now I'm supporting more program level assessment because 14 of our undergraduate programs are actually ABET accredited. And I really appreciate that particular accrediting body actually has requirements for students as stakeholders in the process. So many of our programs have very well established ways to gather input about the student experience. So the challenge is more through my work with that assessment committee or my individual work with those programs, helping them think about ways where they could nudge that from students really just consulting or providing information or still maybe being the object of assessment to being more of the actors and leaders or collaborators in that process. And of course, with 14 programs, there's 14 different approaches. So it's a bit labor intensive. I see another question from Melanie in the chat about other literature, framework, or models that we could point the audience to. And I have a few pieces of literature that I'll put into the chat now. And Healy's model comes to mind as kind of thinking about the spaces where students could contribute, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists.
I mean, I do think there's just a lot in the space of students as partners or student partnerships. I think something that's been really is kind of my transition into this work is like from coming from a more teaching focused background, a lot of folks might consider pedagogy that involves like co-construction of knowledge with students or co-constructing anything with students, involving them in influencing the syllabus or influencing the course design. So I think if you kind of follow that line of thinking, anything with co-construction with students, I think you can learn a lot of the frameworks or the philosophy of why it might make sense to also co-construct things related to assessment with students.
Well, we're coming upon the close of our hour. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone that came today. You asked so many thoughtful questions. You had so many thoughtful comments that I hope some of you are moved to fill out that Google form and consider joining us in space at a future meeting. And thank you to the panelists for being so intentional and around constructing the themes by which you would share ideas around authentic student partnership today. And the many stories from the many institutions, I think, gave something to everyone.